I've just realised I've screwed up completely. Sorry. Was I sharing my screen or not?
Yes,
Shall I just start again?
Yeah,
I'll start again. Sorry. Sorry. 5. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another E5 podcast. I am your host, Paul Meenan, and I am joined by one of my tag team partners.
Hello, I'm JW.
And it's just me and JW tonight, unless Mr. Watts, aka Sparky Ninja, just magically appears on the screen because he was invited to this. But he is no doubt being a fantastic father and probably a rather exhausted teacher, because I believe he's been doing his large-scale EV course. I think he's one of the only providers in the UK that's doing all that good stuff. So yeah, we're gonna ride this one. And again, we said we'd only do podcasts if there was stuff to talk about, and boy, have we got a small queue. So we'll get on with something that we thought was quite an interesting conversation. So I'll introduce the topic. EICRs. Dun, dun, dun. I got asked a really interesting question, which hit me for 6. And it was literally, which edition do I use? And I was like, pardon? What do you mean? What edition do you use? And so a peer of mine literally rung me up and said, I've just done a load of EICRs. They have failed miserably. I've got like over 90 C2s alone. And I've put a quote in to do all the remedial works. And they said that the client has basically turned around and said, no, I'm not accepting it. Why have you done it to Amendment 2 of the 18th edition? You shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't mean it was unsafe when it was installed. And he'd kind of like, it stalled the engine in his brain. And to be honest with you, I was a bit miffed as to why I would even be asked that question. But then it stalled my engine of my brain, and it got me going. So I thought, what we're going to do is we're going to go through something that I'm going to try and do more and more of in these podcasts, and we're going to discuss the application of engineering logic, because it's becoming fairly evident that for as many standards that are out there, you need to develop your own mental pathways to narrate your logic, your understanding, as you beautifully do in your videos, John. So what I've done is I've prepared some really boring slides. That way people can read along if you're watching in YouTube land or in Spotify land or whatever podcasting world platform we're on now. So I will share my screen, and hopefully, John, you'll tell me that you can see my screen now.
Yep, we can.
Marvelous. And there is our beloved Mr. Skirm. So every time you see him, just imagine the words no, 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 no. Just before we get on as well, the Amendment 3 and 4 podcasts, really positive reactions to them, to be honest with you, quite overwhelming. Not bad for ones that we winged very quickly and had headaches doing. But yeah, thank you very much for that. Looking forward to when the permanent edition comes out. But anyway, we'll get on with this. So EICRs, which edition to use? Who knows? My computer actually works, would be nice. So one of the biggest problems that most people have is the wiring regs every 2-3 years. There's a new DPC, a new edition, a new amendment. We're now into the world of Amendment 4. As I said to you before, John, we may be qualified in the 18th edition, Amendment 21. Who knows? Who knows? But that is the benchmark for electrical installations. Please note, it's the minimum standard, not the one that you fight over. It's the one you work from the intent. And it's my favorite picture, so I use it all the time. It's like mind reading. It's like telepathy, trying to figure all this out in industry now, trying to understand what regulations are what and what people are thinking and how they want to interpret stuff. Henceforth, we're going to try and go on an engineering logic. And if you disagree with what we're saying, or you can add more, please put it in the comment thing on YouTube, because that always helps everybody have and develop a better understanding of this wonderful world of electricery. So we'll get in, and one of the really important things to note is you need to be able to tell a story. So we're obviously basing it on Amendment 2, the wiring regulations, which we're on. No, sorry, we're on Amendment 3, but that's one reg. So that's kind of the current book. And if you open up the book straight away on page 2, so we've put the note on the bottom of the screen, there is a line, and we've used this before in other podcasts, but again, it's a good platform to start narrating. So on page 2, it clearly says, and I've highlighted it, while the publisher and contributors, which is the committee, believe that the information and guidance given in this work is correct. Please note, this is information and guidance. Okay, so this is not worth arguing over. This is information and guidance that we want to understand better. So all parties, it says, must rely on their own skill and judgment. John, when you're wiring a house, you must rely on your skill and judgment. You mustn't listen to something that's somebody said in a webinar or something else. Rely on your own skill and judgment when making use of it. The publisher, which is joint BSI and IET, and contributors, the Wiring Regs Committee, do not assume liability to anyone for any loss or damage caused by any error omission. So very clearly, if there is an error in the Wiring Regs, which has happened over the years, not their problem. Whether such error omission is a result of negligence or any other cause, i.e. typo, printing, don't know, any and all such liability is disclaimed. It then skips the participation of JPEL. It then says, this publication does not purport to include all necessary provisions of a contract. So don't use the wiring regulations as a contract because it doesn't have all the legalese. Users are responsible for its correct application. Compliance with British standard cannot confer immunity from legal obligations. So from my perspective, I work on a railway and I will tell a contractor in a contract, one of the standards that I want you to use the guidance and information in is BS 7671 for railways. But I'll also tell people, please don't use 7671 for everything, because in 110.2, it exempts the earthing side of a railway electrical installation, because that's other standards, other guidance. So that's how I start narrating my story. John, do you want to cover this one?
Yeah, this, well, it's in the introduction, and the regulations apply to the design, erection, and verification of electrical installations, additions and alterations to existing installations, and then most importantly, existing installations that have been installed in accordance with earlier editions of the regulations may not comply with this edition in every respect. This does not necessarily mean that they are unsafe for continued use or require upgrading. So this is really important. So yeah, there's going to be plenty of things that don't comply if something was installed, say, 5, 10, 20 years ago. However, something that was perfectly fine 20 years ago doesn't instantly become dangerous and unsafe just because some words in this book were changed.
John, do you think that we've allowed ourselves to almost, I'm guilty of this, almost when the book has changed, it's almost generated a mass hysteria in industry to rush out and go and do things?
Yes, it has. Look at
Mm,
RCDs, for example. I mean, 20 years ago, you put RCDs on socket outlets, and that was pretty much it. You didn't put it on lighting, and you didn't put it on most anything else. And of course, more recently, it's changed so that now RCDs are required on almost everything. However, if you go to somebody's house and they've got a 20-year-old consumer unit and there's no RCD on the lighting, does that mean it's immediately dangerous and it's a C2 and all that? No, it doesn't.
mm.
It just means that some words in a book have been altered, and yeah, it could be beneficial to have RCDs on those to stop people putting pictures in the wall above the light switch and all that kind of thing, or at least protect them if they put nails through the wires. But the thing is, it's the same installation that they had 10, 15, 20 years ago. It hasn't actually changed in what it was designed for and how it's being used. So
I
caution is
think
needed.
I think you're right, John. I think one of the things I think we'll see in this is there is a perpetual conflict within the narrative, and I hope people listening and watching this will see that there is a perpetual conflict in how we apply this standard, which I think has led to conflicts within individuals, groups, entities, etc. But hopefully we can kind of, the outcome will be a logic in your own mind, because again, this for me is it's the floor, it's not the ceiling. If I want to level up, I'll step on the book and get a little bit higher. I should understand the principles of this. And we've said in previous podcasts, fundamental principles is pretty much the best part of the regs to know, because that helps you comply with the law. Now, interestingly, one of the other things on page 16, folks, there's a lovely bit of narrative that says BS 7671 will continue to be amended from time to time, to take account of the publication of new or amended CENELEC or IEC standards, CENELEC being Europe, IEC being global. The opportunity has been taken to revise regulations that experience has shown require clarification, or to allow for new technology and methods. That's really interesting. That's the push bit, isn't it, John, for why things keep changing?
Yeah, I mean, new technology. I mean, look at AFDDs, which are relatively new, being sort of crept in certain areas. But of course, 10 years ago, they didn't really exist in this country, but they do now. That doesn't mean they're
Yes,
necessarily a bad thing, but on the other hand, just because someone hasn't got any doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be some big fail. But on the other hand, you've also got to consider that because this stuff now exists and didn't exist before, it might be a good idea to actually use it in at least some places.
indeed. And also, to quote Mr. Skirm, because if he was still here now, he would be saying new equipment is fine, but as long as it meets the essential health and safety requirements of all the various European directives, it's got its CE marking, there is a technical file of compliance available, then he would fully support and endorse that. But we do know from the EV world that there are products out in the market that have no standard and no proper conformance, which is why, wrongly, in my professional opinion, BS 7671, an installation guidance standard, was used as a product standard, which was one of his bugbears, God rest him.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
the problem with that is you'd had their sort of technology was getting ahead of any kind of standards, whatever else. Stuff was being manufactured and being shoved on the market. And it's like, well, here's a load of stuff, and it supposedly does all of this stuff. But equally, it was just which manufacturer's making it determined what he actually did and maybe didn't do. So a bit of a mess there, and it was really completely the wrong way around. But that
Indeed,
unfortunately is happening, and it's going to happen more and more in the future as we get more and more technology stuffed into pretty much everything.
indeed. You want to cover this one?
Yeah, this has been at the front of the association for some decades, probably, but this is the note by the Health and Safety Executive. And the most important bit here is that the standards in question are regarded by HSE as likely to achieve conformity with the relevant parts of the Electricity at Work Regulations 1989. Notice likely. Installations to which BS 71 is relevant may have been designed and installed in accordance with an earlier edition, now superseded, but then current. That in itself would not mean that the installation would fail to comply with the Electricity at Work Regulations 1989. Now, this is a terrible bit of wording, really. Basically, it's saying that if you comply with BS 71, it could comply with the Electricity at Work Regulations, and in many cases would, but not necessarily. But on the other hand, if you've got one that was designed to some older one, then it could comply with that, but on the other hand, it might not. So take your pick as to what actually this means.
It's a very difficult one, isn't it? Because it's like, well, does it comply? Does it not comply? And if it doesn't comply, does it mean it doesn't comply? So you can see why the application of C1 and C2s may have been rightly or wrongly applied. But I think one of the things that's my logic is C1 and C2 codes are an immediate risk assessment at now. It's like an MOT. It's an assessment of risk now, not when it was installed. Yeah, not necessarily using the current regs, but it's an immediate risk set. Can I see something that will kill me, that will harm a person? Well, then it's a C1. Can I see something if it goes wrong that will harm the person or the installation? Then it could potentially be, if one thing goes wrong, it will be a C2. That's an immediate risk assessment. That's the problem. I think the C3s and the FIs are the more, you can have as many as you want of them, but not necessarily fail the installation. And I do think we probably use C2 wrongly, but please let us know what you think. This is about engineering judgment, engineering logic. So if we go into page 22 of the big brown book, Chapter 12, objects and effects. Just want to kind of take a reset moment and remind everyone 121 BSM 671 contains requirements for design, erection, verification of electrical installations so as to provide for safety and proper functioning for the intended use. That generally doesn't have a timeline to it because, in theory, you should be designing and erecting and verifying that that installation is fit to use for its intended design life, which may be 25 years, 30 years, 40 years. One of the challenges we have, John, as you know as well, you'll walk into installations that are still working from the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, I had one of them this week.
Oh, did you really?
Frosty, yes. Well, there was some other work done at the place anyway, but it started out with, oh, we just wanted a new light putting up in the lounge.
Oh, God.
Pretty ordinary. So it'd undo the ceiling rose, no CPC in it. That's a bad
Nice.
start. So we take the ceiling rose off the ceiling, and behind it, there's a couple of little chop block things that someone has connected about 2 inches or so of modern cable onto. And then the other bit is black and red, cotton covered, rubber insulated business just poked up into the ceiling. And then checked a few of the other rooms downstairs. Yeah, they're all the same. And the light switches are the same. Manky little boxes in the wall with just singles poking through, crumbling to dust, one of which had just bare wires coming through the rubber grommet and the bottom of the box. So that obviously turned into rewiring the lighting circuit. So you never know what you can find.
Yeah, that sounded like fun then. So, just staying back to that, chapter 13 states fundamental principles, doesn't cover the detail because the rest of the book does. We go on to the question then, why do we test to the current regulations? Why do we? So if my computer works. Well, this is the boring bit, I suppose. There's no pictures. This is just this is my brain vomiting on a page or on a slide. So why do we inspect and test the current regulations? Well, generally when we're doing it, we're reflecting the current safety standards. So electrical safety is very much a rapidly evolving field with new hazards emerging and older practices becoming outdated. Unfortunately, one thing I do have problems with, a lot of older practices, some shouldn't be out, they shouldn't disappear. They should be held in a repository somewhere, in my opinion. The latest edition 7671 incorporates the most up-to-date safety standards. Yeah, hopefully it does. Reflecting current industry knowledge and technology. And that's really interesting because industry knowledge changes. When we find out something that we've gone for was good, henceforth, like in the recent Amendment 4, they've removed a lot of the surge protection, still in there, but a lot of the guff around it, they've decided to remove that knowledge, probably because it was causing more ambiguity. But older editions may not address modern risks, such as newer materials, methods of installations, fire requirements that's creeping in more and more and more. Changes in how electricity is used in homes and businesses, a lot more wireless charging, all that sort of stuff. Emerging technologies, EV, solar, smart home devices. And the trouble is if you use an earlier edition, that could lead to overlooking a safety concern that's there, but has only been identified in recent years. Key point as an example, Mr. Ward, is bidirectional RCDs, which is in Amendment 3.
Yep.
Whole new challenge of safety stuff. So in theory, we should be using Amendment 3 in our EICRs now. And I guarantee you that one key safety concern, it's going to cause carnage. What do you think,
Yeah.
John?
Yeah. I mean, that's something which presumably nobody had thought of until people like solar and batteries were being shoved in, and it's a justifiable concern. And now we've got a whole pile of installations out there that have had solar and batteries and things in them potentially for years on the wrong types of equipment. So that is definitely an example of where at the time nobody would have noticed or really no note of it. But of course now, because of improved knowledge, we know that those devices are not suitable for use in that particular application. So those should be replaced. And if you're going to do an EICR, then that is something which will be noted on it, probably as a C2. And yet at the
Yeah,
time, it wouldn't have been even thought of.
yeah. And I think that's when you have a known risk. And we will do another podcast where we talk about solar risks and some of the new issue. Well, when I say new, they're not new, are they? There's some of the more unknown solar stuff we'll cover in upcoming podcasts. But just carrying on with why we would inspect and test current regulations. I'll do this one, John. Compliance with legal and industry requirements. So we now know, and just to be clear, 7671 itself is not law, but it forms the foundation, the basis for compliance with legal frameworks like the Electricity at Work regs. If you don't comply with the AWR, you don't comply with health and safety at work regs, etc., etc. But by using the latest edition, electricians, contractors can ensure their work adheres to current legal expectations. Because remember, when you're in a court of law, you're expected to come there with your engineering logic, with your defence, with a valid argument, with your thoughts and your evidence to prove that you are not guilty. Many regulations, such as those in building safety and landlords, also reference 7671, which we'll get onto. Relying on an older version could lead to a non-compliance with current legal requirements, especially if specific clauses have been updated or revised in recent editions. And I'm going to use the 202 regulation for premature collapse 521, I think it is. I'm rusty. But that sort of critical regulation that changed, real moral compass in applying that. But yet a lot of electricians argue over ensuring premature collapse. Where's your defense? Just think of that. Stop arguing with each other and go, where is my defense in a court of law? When we are designing, selecting, and erecting, you must be thinking about what your defense is. Right, we'll go on to the next one if it works. Oh, that's right. Yep. John, go for that one.
Yeah. So yeah, advancements in technology and installation methods, which currently are happening with increasing speed. So new technologies and installation methods regularly emerge, and the latest edition of BS 7671 includes provisions for these. And two examples is electric vehicle charging, and of course there's now a specific section there for installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and renewable energy sources, solar panels, energy storage, and grid interaction with renewables are key areas also covered in more recent versions. And of course, older editions wouldn't account for these advancements because they didn't exist at the time, and that could potentially lead to non-compliant or unsafe installations in the context of newer technologies. So again, it was fine at the time, but if you're going to go to somebody's house that was wired up in, say, the 1970s, it was not considered that people would have solar panels on their house. It was not considered they'd have batteries in the garage powering half the house. Nobody had electric cars, or at least no one in their house had electric cars in the 70s. And you can't just bung all this new technology in and hope it's going to work perfectly with stuff that was designed 30, 50, or however many years ago. Your sound's not working.
Is my sound working now?
It's working now, yeah.
Have I just narrated a load of stuff and it's been completely lost?
You have.
I'll repeat that and we'll just leave it in because we'll keep rolling. So one of the things I was saying at the end of yours, John, was it's interesting about the new technologies, the battery storage, the solar PV, these like unicorn neutral earth links. There's not much information on inspection and testing yet on that. And the technology is moving at such a pace. We're desperately trying to catch up. So I think on the inspection and testing, we always got to try and be ahead of the curve because at the moment industry is behind the curve. So there's quite a moral dilemma as to how much we do. So using the latest edition, I think, is essential, but the application in context is really important. Now, moving on to why we would test to the current regulations or inspect and test, we need to adapt to changes in usage and loads. The way electricity is consumed has dramatically changed. John, we've covered this in webinars where it was very linear, very load-based, resistive. over time. Now it's bi-directional, current flow, local generation, very local networked, power over grid, electric vehicle power grids, all sorts. So with increasing reliance on electronic devices, which is the bit that I struggle with, because electronics can be rubbish and can fail. So are we producing more and more things, more points of failure? Smart home technology, high demand appliances, don't really see that much of them, maybe other than the EV. The latest edition of Wine Regs reflects these changes in load management and energy use. And we actually asked at one of the IET webinars, when are we going to get some revised guidance on maximum demand, selectivity, diversity of installations, given the fact that we're using far lower loads now, and we're still working on 100-watt lamps when we're teaching electricians now. So again, using an older edition could result in under specification of circuit ratings, or technically over specification, inadequate protective measures, or overlooked issues with earthing and bonding in a modern context. Now, I can tell you now, I've seen designs where it's been maximum demand of 280 amps, but in the reality, it's been like 100.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So
mean,
yeah,
the domestic stuff is classic for that, because a lot of the things you'll see, assuming they've got any documents, it'll say things, oh, just like maximum demand, someone's put down 80 amps or 100 amps. It's like, no, it isn't. There's no way this house can possibly be taking 80 amps or whatever. And you go in and it's got like gas heating, and it's got a gas hob in the kitchen, and there's no electric showers or anything. Where's your 80 amps coming from? It's just not.
mate, my house, I've put a power quality analyzer on it for 2 months, sat there watching it. 14 amps was the peak. What
Yeah.
was interesting was the frequency. Wow, that was all over the place. The frequency, that was going like -4, +4 hertz. That can pummel the equipment. That's not good. That's a really poor power supply quality, I've noticed. Do you want to cover the insurance bit?
Yeah, now insurance liability. Now, most buildings, of course, have insurance, and many insurance companies require electrical installations to be inspected and maintained according to the latest edition of BS 7671. And if that's what it's going to say, and if you use an earlier edition, that could result in a refusal to pay out on claims if there's an electrical incident and it's found outdated standards were applied. And furthermore, in the event of an electrical incident, failure to apply the latest standards could expose electricians, inspectors, or building owners to liability, and using outdated regulations might be considered negligence in such cases. Check your insurance company documents, including those for your house, because who even reads those things? Probably nobody. But we should be reading them to see what they actually say and what they actually require.
Yes, and I can tell you now, most commercial operating companies, when you look at those documents, they will say that you must have all the necessary building services, certification, maintenance records, and if you haven't got a satisfactory EICR, you should have a plan that takes you to a satisfactory level. So that's quite an interesting one, because I think there's a hell of a lot of infrastructure in the country that doesn't necessarily have that. Moving on as to why we should test to current regulations or inspect and test. My favourite thing: continuous improvement, plan, do, check, act, the old Deming cycle, and lessons from incidents. Each update to 7671 reflects lessons learned from electrical incidents, fires, or accidents. The fire in Stevenage and in Southampton, where the fire brigade were killed, and the coroner wrote a letter to the Wine Regs Committee to have the UK specific reg put in for premature collapse. This is why I never understood why people would argue over it, because like people died. What sort of moral compass do we have where we're arguing over a regulation over some metal tie wraps and better fixings? It's mind blowing. But anyway, that's my rant over. Regulatory bodies revise standards to prevent repeat occurrences of past failures. By using the latest edition, inspectors are ensure they're applying improved methods based on the most recent data. Early editions may not account for these important improvements. Like the first edition, for instance, very vast and vague in its 4 pages of detail. John?
Yep, and this is consistency across the industry. So by using the latest edition, professionals ensure that all electrical installations are being assessed on the same up-to-date criteria. This fosters consistency in the industry where electrical installations are inspected and maintained using uniform standards, and it avoids confusion or discrepancies that might arise if different inspectors were using different versions of the regulations. And this is really important because if, say, you had a shop or something where you had some people in to do the electrical inspection, if someone came in and did it to the latest 18th Amendment, whatever, and then the previous documents done like the year before were done to like the 14th edition or something, they're not going to match up in any kind of meaningful way. And then it's like, what are you supposed to use here?
Mm,
So yeah, consistency is important.
indeed. Right, so the next reason why we would inspect and test current regulations, transition periods and effective dates. So BS 7671 updates are usually accompanied by transition periods, so whether it be 3 months, 6 months immediately, gives professionals or electricians time to adjust to the new standards. I think over the years, more and more people are paying attention, but then again, more and more people are doing amazing stuff online. So the likes of GSH, we're trying to do our bit. ECA do their bit, NIC do their bit, NAPIT do their bit, Alex, everybody does their bits. Everybody's trying to get people to level up with their knowledge. And being a Spark is a bloody long job. It's long hours, it's hard physically, hard mentally, and trying to keep up with hundreds of pages is very difficult. But after these transition periods end, only the latest edition is regarded as best practice. And in fact, in recent editions, they've even said that the previous editions are now withdrawn, which was a new thing. So we withdrew the use of the old standards to try and enforce that you use the current one. So again, if you're having this debate, say the previous editions are withdrawn, that we use this for these reasons. Continuing to use an older edition after the transition period could be seen as non-compliant and leave installations at risk of not meeting current expectations. But then again, contractually, you may be. Crossrail was designed to the 16th edition. It was installed to the 17th edition. There was a gap analysis done. There was change. There was a cost. So let's get on to the law bit, John. So BS 7671 is itself is not a law. It's not, even though it's called regulations, which is a naming thing. I think it's more about marketing the book because regulations are secondary pieces of legislation, whereas the wiring regulations, I mean, it's got two names. So it's got requirements for electrical installations, which is the correct name because it is what it says on the tin. But then IET wiring regulations is a secondary name, and that in almost to some people will infer that it's law. It is not law. It is a voluntary code of practice developed by the IET and the BSI under a joint license. However, it can be legally enforceable if it's referenced in legislation or regulations. So legislation or acts, regulations are secondary. Although BS 7671 is not a statutory document, it is referred to in legal frameworks such as EAWR, Building Regulations Part P. So Part P will mandate that you comply with BS 7671, and that governs electrical safety in dwellings. If you look at stuff like the Social Housing Regulation Act of 2023, that introduces standards such as requiring electrical installations to be inspected, and that aligns with the practices in 7671. So unless you write your own standard and say it clearly supersedes the mine regs, you will comply with that. And if you don't, well, you may get in trouble if there is a problem. So when BS 7671 is referred in these regulations, it becomes the de facto standard for electrical safety, which professionals, contractors, designers are expected to follow. In this context, compliance 671 is considered evidence of meeting the legal requirements set out by those regulations. However, you are, if you wish to, like London Underground do, you can write your own standards which are tailored to the specific use, installation requirements, and give you more detail. So I have seen across the railways installation standards that go far above the wiring regulations, which give you a far more risk averse fixed installation suitable for its use, suitable for the designer to take guidance from. And that's kind of where we want. So the regulations is a minimum. And this is why I'd love the industry to go away from. I want the industry to stop saying the wine regs, yeah, I fully comply with it. No, you don't. You never can. It's a guidance note. You work from the intent and it's specific to the nature of the use. It's different in schools, in hotels, in railways, in nurseries, in domestic homes. it's different horses for different courses, I suppose. So BS 7671 is not a law, but it becomes legally enforceable when referenced in statutory regulations like EAWR building regs. Following 7671 is the recognised way to demonstrate compliance with these legal requirements, and failure to comply can lead to. Now, I think this controversial moment, I think most people don't comply because I think there's a knowledge gap with how to work from it. Too many people fight to comply with it. Now, I know the narrative says following 7671, but it really should say working from the intent of BS 7671. Now, if you don't, there are fines. Again, if someone gets electrocuted and dies, unlimited fines, imprisonment, penalties, legal action, and you're on a roller coaster of at least 8 years to get to court. You've got negligence claims if you do poor electrical work, which can cause injury and damage. We know people who have had to remedy, even Paul Skirm had to go to a house where people were getting shocks off radiators. More importantly, voiding of insurance policies. If installation is found to be non-compliant with 7671, they may just turn and say you're not compliant. Same with fire alarms. If you don't have a 5839 certificate, your fire alarm system will not be insured. Who would insure something? Unless you can evidence clearly and concisely that you meet the intent of that standard and go above and beyond. So you'll work from the intent. So, for instance, I could write a standard above 5839 that met the principles of 5839, i.e. fire alarm standard, but if it went to another level, another nth degree of protection, then I wouldn't worry about 5839. And I could sit in front of a judge and an expert, and the expert would hopefully go, that works from the intent of 5839 and is specific to the installation's risks, use, etc., and is revised and updated. Right, next bit. So why do we inspect and test to the current regulations? John, would you like to introduce BS0?
Yep, that is BS0, a standard which, unlike all other standards, you can get for free. So you can download it right now. Yes. It's the only one, so don't get too excited over that. But anyway, okay. BS0 basically sets out a standard to which all other standards are supposed to be written. And 3.1.32 defines a document as established by consensus and approved by a recognised body that provides for common and repeated use rules, guidelines, or characteristics for activities or the results aimed at the achievement of the optimum degree of order in a given context. And standards are based on the consolidated results of science, technology, and experience and aimed at the promotion of optimum community benefits. Now, of course, that obviously refers to all standards for everything, not necessarily electrical installations, but Indeed. It covers all of them.
Indeed. And then if you go into page 7 of BS0, it talks about its voluntary status and British standards. And this is very clear here. And this is about, again, what we said, develop the engineering. British standards are voluntary in that there is no obligation to apply them or comply with them. So even though it's mentioned in law, you could use BS0, but however, just to be clear here, you better have a bloody defence. You better say that I've done more than what is in BS 7671. You can't just ignore them completely, unless you decide that you're some sort of mental person who, I don't know, to just turn around and blanketly ignore stuff is just a bit silly, really. Except in a few cases where their application is directly demanded by regulatory instruments. They are tools devised for the convenience of those who wish to use them. So regulation, British standards are tools for convenience. In certain circumstances, the action of third parties might have the effect of making the application of a standard a commercial necessity, i.e. a contract, but BSI has no control over these actions and is not party to them. So as far as BSI are concerned, they're not interested in it forms part of a contract because it's not suitable sufficient. Yet most people in commercial industrial will be told you will comply fully with the wiring regs contractually. Well, you may not be able to because it's such a generic, wide scope of standards. You may not have access to all the standards. So yeah, it's an interesting voluntary standing, these regulations. Next one, John.
Okay, that's authority and reliability. That's page 7 if you want to have a look in BS0. For a British standard to be a useful and attractive tool for conducting business or supporting public policy, it has to command the trust and respect of all those that are likely to be affected by it. And the reliability of a British standard rests not just on its technical accuracy and the sound judgment of those responsible for its text, there also needs to be a wider held confidence that it is desirable, practical, and authoritative. It offers no particular nor exclusive advantage to any party, so you can't put your patent pending business in there. It serves the needs of the wider community, and in application it will be consistent with regulations and legal principles established at the time of publication.
Interesting. I do think 7671 over the years has had a bit of a kicking, and I think I think this probably is the one part of BS0 that has given it the biggest kicking. The trust and respect of all those affected by it. I think you only got to go on social media to see that 7671 probably doesn't have the trust and respect that it should have. But then again, is it the fault of the people criticizing it, or is it the fault of the standard itself? Again, not criticizing all the good work the committees do, but we have sat on podcasts before, John, and we have seen some absolute clangers in these standards. So they're not beyond. And this is the thing, when you see errors and omissions and mistakes in the regs, you definitely then get comfortable with knowing that they are guidance. There's something you work from.
Yeah.
You see through the mistakes and you work with a logic from those mistakes. So moving on, page 8, there's some really good bits in BS0. This is why we're covering it. Principles of application. So it clearly says in 4.3.1, responsibility for selecting and applying a standard lies with its user. In general, British Standards Institute is not able to assist in this, nor take responsibility. So they're saying it's up to you what standard you choose. Other than to provide an indication of the scope and contents of a standard in some circumstances, BSA might develop formally published guidance documents on the application of a particular standard. So I know 5839 BSI have done a guidance note on that. Standards are drafted in the expectation that those who use them will be appropriately experienced, qualified, and equipped to do so. They will apply them conscientiously and, where necessary, take sound advice by others qualified to provide it. What's that to you, John?
Yeah, I mean, in context of BS 7671, in other words, you're not going to just pick up this book from knowing nothing and then just have a quick read and off you go and start designing and installing electrical installations. And it also covers that if you're going to use something like BS 7671, it's expected that you have a decent understanding of what it actually means. So if you see a mistake in there, you should be able to actually spot it and hopefully consider that that's actually not correct or it's something you could do differently. And maybe even advise those that wrote it that there's a mistake and it should be updated for a future reference amendment. So
this is an interesting one because I think there's been for years on social media, lots of people have said, you know, electricians, when do you see an electrician carrying the iron rigs around with them? Well, it depends on the electrician. It's such a wide scope, our industry. The house basher will probably have one in the front of his van, hopefully. The industrial electrician probably won't. But should they? Should they have access to it? Should they be reading it regularly? Should they be doing regular CPD on it? I'd argue to be appropriately experienced, qualified, and equipped to do so. So I'll put my devil's advocate hat on. You're an employer, you've got 20 electricians and a few apprentices or whatever. How do you ensure that they're, because again, you know, the judges may use this in a court of law. How will you ensure that they're appropriately experienced, qualified, and equipped to use 7671? Because your defence may be, oh well, Your Honour, I sent my foreman out with my lads and they were designing some site temps. Okay, were they appropriately experienced, qualified, and equipped to do so in using 7671? Well, they may be qualified because they've got an 18th edition certificate, but are they experienced? Have you got records that show they're regularly looking at 7671 and equipped with an actual copy of it? Because if they don't have a copy of it, but they've got a certificate and they're not used to using it, then your argument, it goes. You haven't got one. The judge will have you. So it's an interesting clause, 4.3.1. John, 432.
yeah, this is interpretation. It's on page 8 of BS0. Responsibility for interpreting a standard rests with its user, informed where necessary by appropriate expert advice. Ultimately, the only body with the power to give a definitive interpretation is a court of law. So again, you can't just rely on what's written in there, and then this is it, because not necessarily. And we've all seen bits in BS 7671 where 10 different people have come up with 10 different explanations as to what a particular thing means. So to avoid undermining the basis for common expectations, as set out in 411, BSI does not provide individual interpretations of standards. Individuals who are approached in their capacity as committee members with question of interpretation or analysis should refer to the relevant BSI committee manager. However, any ambiguities, consistencies, or possible errors notified to BSI will be referred for consideration to the committee responsible for the standard in question, as will any proposals for changes or improvements. These notifications are encouraged as a contribution to the maintenance of standards. So yeah, if you open up BSI 701 tomorrow and find something in there that's obviously completely wrong, let people know. Send an email to the relevant committee. The address is in the front of the book. Tell them about it. They may even alter it and change it and update it.
Or they may ask you to join that committee and
Who
tell
knows?
them more.
Yes.
You never know.
But yeah,
Perhaps, maybe.
bear in mind, all the people on these committees are actual people. They're not some kind of sort of weird machines or something. They are actual real people, and they do have real things to do. So yeah, it's and of course people make mistakes. And with a document like BSS 601, which has got what 600 odd plus pages now, it's inevitable that there's going to be mistakes and things in it. How can there not be with that volume of stuff in it and the volume of changes which are coming through all the time? So yeah, absolutely. If you see things that need improvement or suggestions or whatever, send them in.
Indeed. So if we disappear out of BS0 and we come back to 7671, page 522, the EICR condition report, again, that guidance for recipients, a couple of bits highlighted that are really relevant. The report is an important and valuable document which should be retained. And note 1 says the purpose of this report is to confirm, so far as is reasonably practicable, the balance of time and cost, whether or not the electrical installation is in a satisfactory condition for continued service. It's not about, is it shiny and smell nice? Is it safe for continued service? Is it satisfactory or unsatisfactory? The report should identify any damage, deterioration, defects, and or conditions which may give rise to danger. That's the risk assessment part I mentioned earlier on. That's C1, C2. C1, can I see it? Can I touch it? Will it kill me now? C2, if one thing goes wrong, and that's the thing. What I don't think people realize in context of engineering logic in using the latest edition, you are doing a dynamic risk assessment now based on the information provided in this wonderful guidance note. If we go down to notes 7 and 8, for items classified as C1 danger present, the safety of those using the installation is at risk, and it's recommended a skilled person or persons competent in electrical installation work undertakes the necessary remedial work immediately. It's interesting, John, that the word persons competent is in there, given the fact that's the only reference to competent person left in the book.
Yeah, they possibly amending should email somebody and have it altered.
Have we found an error? We may have found an omission.
Or
Possibly.
an oversight, perhaps.
An oversight, yes.
Yes.
We're not doing it deliberately. Apologies. So note 8, for items classified as a C2, the safety of those using the installation may be at risk, and it is recommended that a skilled person or persons competent in electrical installation undertakes the necessary remedial work as a matter of urgency. So the difference between C1 and C2, necessary remedial work immediately, and remedial work as a matter of urgency. Henceforth, we use the C1, I can see it, I can touch it, it will kill me now. C2, one thing needs to go wrong, and then, you're going to get hurt. So it's worthwhile using that as you are dynamically risk assessing, and that's your risk assessment. Now, if we go into guidance note 3, which is a plethora of information, we're not going to cover all of it, but it clearly states again, electrical installation in the UK that comply with 7671 are likely to satisfy the relevant parts of statutory regulations, such as TAWR. However, this cannot be guaranteed. It is stressed that it is essential to establish which statutory and other regulations apply, as we've mentioned earlier, and to install accordingly. For example, an installation in a premise subject to licensing may have requirements different from an additional to those of 7671. These will take precedence. So, for instance, railways have operating licenses to run trains. Pubs have operating licenses. They may have requirements above 7671 or differing, and that's fine. And that's what that reg's telling you to do. John?
Yep. So BS 7671 applies to the design, erection, and verification of electrical installations, including additions and alterations, and to the inspection, testing, and reporting of existing installations. Existing installations that have been installed in accordance with earlier editions or regulations may not comply with the current edition. This does not necessarily mean that they are unsafe for continued use or that they require upgrading. The person or persons carrying out the inspection and testing of such an installation must decide whether the installation is safe and suitable for continued use. Inspection and testing can only be conducted according to requirements of the current version of BS 7671. That's not necessarily quite right. The inspector must determine whether any shortcomings are classified as safety issues or recommendation for improvement. So basically, it all comes down to the person or persons carrying out the inspection and testing. Now, interesting that it says it can only be conducted according to the requirements of the current version, because there are plenty of examples where it's going to be done to a previous version or a specific version, one of which is the deal in England for private rented sector properties. Now, at the moment, that particular piece of legislation states that the electrical safety standards shall be met in all of these rented properties, and for reasons unknown to those persons who wrote it, the actual legislation specifically mentions BS 7671 2018, which is the Brown Book. Now, at the moment, that is the current version, but in 5 years' time, that ain't going to be the current version. And of course, is that legislation going to be updated? Probably not. So then in 5 years' time, you're going to have a situation where you're going to go out to a property that's owned by some landlord and do an electrical inspection. To comply with the actual legislation, you're going to have to use BS 7671 2018 and not whatever version's out in 5 years' time.
So I'm going to use my Sherlock Holmes mentality. Not that I'm saying I've met the person who wrote it, but I do believe that there was an error or omission or a misinterpretation of what went in there, because what they should have put was BS 7671 and left it there and not put the current, because that was, I think we covered that in a podcast a while ago. I think Ryan, I think it made his blood boil. Because yes, you're absolutely right. In theory, that one error or omission potentially in that law for social housing means that in 5-10 years' time, you may be doing EICRs to previous editions, which is, as we know from our engineering logic and narrative that we've been discussing, is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
So there is a law out there that is fundamentally flawed.
But until it's adjusted or altered, that's the law. So good luck.
And that's,
you'll need it.
yes, and that's the thing. Again, we're not going to go into all the detail of it, but as we've said many a time, that hierarchy of defence. So Regulation 29 of the EAWR, we did an EAWR versus 7671 webinar, and a lot of the answers were the whole Section 29 defence. Have you taken all reasonable steps to prevent the commissioning of offence? When you look at EAWR, you'll notice that the high-level principles of compliance do map to the fundamental principles very, very well. Earthing, external environment considerations, all that sort of stuff. Now, interesting, you're never going to be prosecuted under EWR, because sitting above the Electricity at Work regulations is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, and that has Section 2, Section 3. And if you go on the HSE website and you look for all the breaches and prosecutions, you'll always see Section 2, Section 3. And that is basically the two bits of the Health and Safety at Work Act that are more commonly used to nail an employer to the wall for not providing a safe place of work or not providing safe work plant and equipment. So that one has the highest penalty. So why would somebody prosecute you for not complying with Regulation 8 earthing on the electricity work regs? They'll take it a step up. Section 2 breach, not providing a safe workplace. So bigger fines, bigger everything. You kind of get the gist. And that is kind of where we're going to leave that one. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody watching can clearly see that there is a narrative, a journey of self-thought that you need to go on when you're having a debate with someone as to why you're not testing to a previous edition. Well, we've clearly mapped out it is best practice to test to the current edition, and if you don't, you import a load of risks that you may not have thought of. So hopefully this debate has been helpful. Fingers crossed. John, what's your thoughts in general on what we've just discussed?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you should be using the latest edition, whatever that happens to be at the time, for all the reasons we've covered there. However, you do have to also consider what's the purpose of the EICR, where are you going, who's actually requesting it, what results are they, what's the actual purpose of having it done in the first place? Is it just to confirm that it's safe to use? Is it confirming that it's complying with all the latest stuff? So most of the time, you're going to use the latest version, but do be aware of, is it a licensed premises? Does the council or whoever state in their stuff, oh, it must comply with a particular version? Is it that dreadful private rented sector thing where it specifically calls out the particular version, even with the ISBN on the actual piece of legislation, which ties it to that specific item? And just be careful as to what you're actually going in there to do. And also it fits in with the scope of the EICR. Are you actually going to go in there and pick up every little tiny piece and every minute detail about every single thing? Or is it a more limited scope thing? Is it just a question of, is it still safe to use? Yeah, it's just
Actually,
find
John,
out before you start.
John, you've just nailed something on it. You're right. It does list the ISBN for the 18th edition, but technically, under Amendment 2, that 18th edition has been withdrawn. So technically, technically, the law is quoting a book that has been withdrawn.
Yeah, it's a mess, isn't it?
So, to anyone out there in social housing land, maybe if you want to have a word with whoever wrote that and say you might want to put an amendment through the Commons and get that updated and just make some minor. I'm pretty sure that the Crown Office can, can actually make some minor amendments in the digital versions online. So yeah, but that's kind of like the whole answer to that question of do I test the latest edition? Yeah, give it a go. Have some engineering logic. Have a good storyline narrating why you're doing your due diligence. You're dynamically assessing risk for the installation after it's been installed for a period of time. You're assessing the use of the building, utilization of the installation, all that good stuff. So, and obviously modern technology and how it's affecting it, mutually impacting it, and all that stuff. So, and it's fairly evident from Amendment 3 there's going to be even more C2s because as electrical installation technology changes, the risks to electrical installations grows ever more dangerous. So please comply with the latest edition when you're doing your ICRs. And if somebody says, no, I don't want you to, they better produce a 50-page document signed off by a lawyer, indemnified by someone at the IET as, yes, this meets the equivalent standard, and make sure you've got a defence in a court of law because, yeah, it's not worth not having that in place. Right, we'll end this here. I'm just going to say we will be back. We've got more weird and random electrical things to talk about. So it may be a week, it may be 2 weeks, but we will be back to talk about solar PV. Hopefully Dave will be bothered to join us. God love him. And until the next one, John, thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. And until the next one, take care of yourself and each other. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Another one in the how the hell do I switch this recording off now?